Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. So I have been reached out by a subscriber of mine and been asked how to make a home sewn garment look less homemade but store-bought. And to be honest, I don't think this is actually the right question here. Because if you have a look around in these fast fashion stores and look at these store-bought clothings, they are not the best quality, to be honest. You see a lot of uneven seams and unclipped threads and maybe loose threads in the fabric, or even holes, and the fabric is horrible. Sorry, I'm not a fan of fast fashion. And actually, I have been approached and got compliments because my clothes were looking homemade. Yes, it was a compliment at this point. Little weird situation because this person was controlling my train ticket. But she wanted to let me know that she absolutely adored my dress and spotted correctly that it was homemade because of the better quality in the sewing. Yes, I think my sewing is superior to the one in the stores for the simple reason that I take my time. You see, the workers in fast fashion are not only underpaid, severely underpaid, but they are usually forced to rush. And they don't have the time to create high quality clothing. That is the reality in this. And it's probably not true for all brands out of there, but for most fast fashion brands, I think that is true. So if you simply take your time and put some love in your garments, I would say you will too be able to achieve a higher quality than the one in the store. But this video would be a bit boring if this was all. So I've been sewing for 14 years and I think I have a couple of tips for you to improve your sewing and be more happy with the quality of your sewing, no matter what actual comparison you're using. You shouldn't compare your work at all to nothing. It's your work and you actually you define the measurement of your sewing quality. So here are 10 tips for improving your sewing. I have actually made a little list so I don't forget anything. So tip number 1, use an appropriate fabric for your pattern. By this I mean don't use a knit fabric for a pattern that is created for a woven fabric and vice versa. You see, a knit fabric does need a different ease, a lot less ease than a woven fabric. So a pattern which is created for a woven fabric would have too much ease for a knit fabric. And you probably don't need the darts, and you don't need such a wide sleeve. There are a couple of differences between the two. So if you're working with a sewing pattern for a woven fabric, use a woven fabric. If the pattern is designed for a knit fabric, use a knit fabric. You can get away with very stable knit fabrics, like sweat or something like that, but as a rule of thumb, use the right fabric for your sewing patterns. Tip number 2, use a decent quality fabric. Yes, I know fabric can be expensive, but do you really want your fabric, your garment, your finished garment, which you spend so much time on, to fall apart after 2 washes? I don't think so. So you should not use the thinnest fabric or a very flimsy, well, it depends on the project. Sometimes you want to work with a thin fabric, but keep in mind that a thin, cheap fabric is usually not the best quality and will not hold on to a washing machine. You might want to wash these garments by hand. And it's a bit tricky for me to tell you what to look for when you're looking for a high quality fabric, because lost my words. An expensive type of fabric is not necessarily the best quality, sadly. And you can also get quite cheap fabric which has a good quality. So it's a bit hard for me to tell you what to look for. In my experience, a knit fabric is more easy to work with when it has some elastane, some spandex in it. So I would go for that, for knit fabrics. You might even want to get a sample. That's maybe a good tip. If you're unsure, get yourself a little fabric sample and throw it into a washing machine for a couple of cycles, and then you can see how it stands up, how it holds up. Oh, and I have already skipped into tip number 3, use a stable fabric. So as I said, knit fabric with some spandex in it will hold better to be worked with and hold the shape of a garment better. Yes, sometimes you want to work with a flimsy rayon knit, but keep in mind that these take a little bit more experience and are worked best with a serger, not with a household sewing machine, to achieve a better result. When you're working with a very thin fabric, you can actually stabilize it. For example, with an iron-on interfacing, or if you want to keep the thinness of a fabric, you can add starch for a temporary stabilization. And you can also use some tissue paper. You put the tissue paper between the pressure foot and your fabric, and this will stabilize your sewing, and then you can tear it apart. Speaking of sewing, use an appropriate needle for your fabric. Yes, there are different kinds of sewing needles. So you want a very strong needle for working with leather or denim. And there are specific sewing needles which are a bit rounded at the tip for knits, so they don't actually pierce your fabrics, so they don't go through the threads but through the little loops in the fabric. You might actually wonder what difference the right sewing needle would make. So, tip number 5 already. These needles should be switched out regularly. Yes, these things get dull over time, and before you start a big sewing project, you should consider switching your sewing needle out. And what you also do, this is probably the most boring tip I have for you, clean your sewing machine regularly. Because the dust and the fibers build up in your sewing machine and they mess with your tension. So if your sewing machine starts to skip stitches or something like that, you might want to check the sewing needle and check if your sewing machine does need a little bit of cleaning. So a very great tip, trust me, is number 7, baste difficult seams. So I always baste my seams when I put in a zipper. And if you're not very confident in putting in, for example, a sleeve or a curved seam, something like that, baste them. Just use very big hand stitches and baste your sewing pieces together before you run it through the sewing machine, this will help you extremely with your sewing difficult seams. So, number 8, don't force your fabric. You see, you should guide your fabric under the sewing machine, because the sewing machine is built to transport your fabric. You should not need to pull or force it through the sewing machine. When you pull your fabric, you might pull it out of shape. And then the stitching, the pieces will pucker, they don't really fit together, they might move, all the things that you don't want to. This is especially important when you're working with a bias cut fabric or a stretchy fabric, because then it's so easy. I know it's tempting, but only stretch your fabric if your sewing instructions specifically state you should stretch these. Like a cuff, for example. A cuff is usually stretched to fit into the sleeve here, or the neckline. These things are typically stretched, but all other things, especially a sleeve, should not be stretched when you're sewing them in place. So, tip number 9. When you cut your fabric, try to be precise with your seam allowance. You don't want your seam allowance to be 5 millimeters or 2 centimeters. It should be a consistent width. And then you can use the little lines on your sewing machine, on your sewing table, as a guide. And you could simply line up your fabric into these lines, and then you have always the right stitching line. And the last tip is another boring one, I know, but really, folks, press your garments after sewing, and in cases already while sewing. I know this is a little bit controversial. Not everyone might agree with me at this point, but I would strongly suggest that you press your garments, even the knit garments, because pressing helps to set in the seams, set in the folds, and especially on knit fabrics, it helps to relax the stitching. So you might see when you are sewing a knit garment together that the seams are a bit wobbly. There's a little bit puckering and something like that. When you press these, especially with steam, it helps to relax the fibers so that waves go mostly away. This works best with natural fibers, but I think you should Also, I think you should also receive some good results with synthetic fibers, but keep in mind you cannot press these as hot as natural fibers. So, this was my little list. Let me know in the comments if you have any additions to this list, what helps you with the quality in your sewing, what does your sewing life make easy, and maybe you disagree on some of my points. Just let us talk about this. So, I hope you find this video a little bit of help, and I will see you in my next one, which will be again a sewing video. Bye for now!